This is the French Connection dope. Kilos of the same dope Eddie Egan and Sonny Grasso took from us. The cops seize it, arrest everyone, and then they start taking it out of the evidence room, whacking it down to nothing and selling it back to us. They basically control the market with it.
Well, Mr. Rossi, surprise.
They've been doing this for years now. They live off it. Oh, we're dope.
Thanks.
What the fuck is happening to the world, Frank? Fucking crooks. Yeah, sad about Bumpy. Things are never gonna be the same in Harlem. You walk down the street, nobody bothers you because Bumpy was making sure. Half a key. How is it there now?
It's chaos, every gorilla for itself.
Who can live like that? There has to be order. That would never happen with Italians. More important than any one man's life is order.
June 25th, 1960, seconds before dawn, 5th Avenue and 52nd. Cartier's front window, plate glass behind a heavy grate, shattered neat as a dentist's drill. A guard, Conrad Nilsson, fired 2 warning shots into the ceiling, but the thief was gone with $31,000 in diamonds. Witnesses saw a young guy in a white shirt dive through the open window of a blue and white sedan. The case looked clean and empty until the follow-up. The Daily News called it the Cartier Solution. Investigators worked Nilsson through the rogues gallery and narrowed it to Joseph Coffey, 23, Lower East Side, 9 collars, 5 priors. The FBI had him too. 5 weeks of shadowing later, Coffey picked up a lean, well-dressed older man, Kingdon Bill de Normand, ex-Dutch Schultz stooge, ex-hijacker who once carried a fake FBI ID he'd made with a cut and paste of J. Edgar Hoover's stationery. 7 carloads of cops and agents tailed the pair from Manhattan to Brooklyn's Paramount and back through the Battery Tunnel. The suspected fence ghosts the meat. On the East River Drive near 23rd Street, the watchers make a call. Pinch them or risk losing the stones again. They roll. In de Normand's breast pocket, hidden behind a row of expensive cigars, they find a tiny bag. Cartier's diamonds. The car yields a ball-peen hammer, and in the mix, $25,000 in Canadian mining securities and AT&T stock tied to 2 Jamaica Queens burglaries. Coffey gets hit with burglary, de Normand with receiving stolen property. A third man, Juan Pasquale, Patsy, Fuca, 27, suspected as the wheelman, is booked for vagrancy. The charge doesn't stick. He walks. 18 months later, different case, same surname. January 19th, 1962. 50 cops and federal agents hit 245 7th Street, a tenement off the Gowanus Canal. Fresh plaster in a basement ceiling gives up 22 half-kilo bricks of pure heroin, about 24 pounds, worth $3.5 million on the street. Behind the stash, a machine gun, a .30 caliber rifle, a shotgun, ammo. Elsewhere, they grab 2 Frenchmen with a Marseille accent, Jacques-Louis Angelvin, a TV personality and bistro owner, and François Scalia, also known as Barbier. The cops say Montreal was their base. The dope came in on the liner United States, hidden in a Buick's rocker panels and splash pans. The drop leads straight back to the Fucas. The father, 60, listed in some reports as Joseph, and the son, Pasquale Patsy, 31. They add the wife, Barbara, 19, a brother, Anthony, and a friend, Nicholas Travato. Assistant D, a Frank Bauman, lays it out in Brooklyn Supreme. January 4th, 1962. Rouen, near Le Havre. Angelvin ships the Buick aboard the United States on January 5th. Scaglia flies to Montreal, then New York on January 8th. Pier 88 is a frozen stakeout. Ahelvan checks into the Waldorf Astoria and parks the car. He doesn't touch it for 5 days. On January 15th, he moves it to a garage at 45 East End Avenue. The next day, Pasquale Fuca takes it downtown to patch the drilled holes. Lab swabs later test positive for heroin. On January 18th, Scalia and an associate pull a blue suitcase from the car and hand it to Pasquale, who brings it to his father's house. When the police open the freshly plastered ceiling at 2:45 7th, the heroin falls out. Angelvin gets held as a material witness, then as a co-conspirator. Justice Samuel Leibowitz severs the Fuca case because their lawyer is tied up in federal court. The headlines call it the biggest heroin seizure in city history. 3 years later, the old man is back in court on a local beef, pool selling in Meriden, Connecticut. Pasquale, Patsy. Fuca, 60, pleads guilty and pays a $100 fine. By 1969, the story is already legend. Robin Moore's The French Connection hits print. The province sums it up. 2 NYPD narcs, Eddie Egan and Sonny Grosso, follow a free-spending hood, Pasquale Fuca, nephew of a Mafia don, from the Copacabana to a Buick that bleeds powder from its fender wells. Months of stakeouts, a dirty basement, and a 3-week sit to catch one of the crew with the goods in hand. The final haul that chapter points to, 112 pounds of heroin, $32 million on the street, puts a hard number on stubbornness and patience. That's how the lines cross. A covert army in Europe. An alliance of dirty cops in New York. A cash network feeding politics. A quiet understanding with gangsters when it suited policy. And on the ground in New York, the same names turn up. First on a jewel job, then in a heroin ceiling, then in a bestseller. Different wars, same trades, leverage, logistics, silence. The heroin haul didn't end in an evidence locker. Dirty cops walked in, lifted most of the dope, and sold it back to the Italians and their Corsican suppliers. They left just enough on the shelf to make the case stick on paper. Most of the players slipped away anyway. 2 men noticed. One wore a badge big enough to change careers. The other wore a crown you couldn't see. Robert Kennedy was already looking to make waves. Bay of Pigs had cost Alan Dulles his job. Henry Anslinger was next. The Kennedys were done with useful idiots. By summer, RFK had his first made man on a hook, Joseph Valachi of the Genovese family, someone who could diagram La Cosa Nostra from the street up. The other man was Joe Bonanno. The bust traced back to his people and blew a spotlight he didn't need. Paranoia took the wheel. Was Gambino doing to him what had been done to Vito Genovese, Carmine Galante, and Vincent Gigante? Or was it just an honest score by the cops that happened to land on Bonanno's doorstep? In Joe's head, it smelled like betrayal. Somebody had talked. Profaci's death only sharpened the edges. Bonanno started moving pieces. In 1963, he reached for the nuclear option. Take out Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, and anyone else in the way. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was years of slights, quiet insults, and the sense that the table was being reset without him. Joe Bonanno decided if he didn't strike first, he'd be next. By 1962, Carlo Gambino wasn't just another boss. He was building something close to untouchable, and the men around him reflected that power. His inner circle tied him to the old guard of Longy Zwilman's empire, to the produce markets, the shipping docks, and even the halls of government. Samuel Big Sue Katz kept the books and made sure the money flowed from every corner of industry, steel, shipping, even transportation contracts tied to the government. Joe Nicholas Gallo, who would rise to consigliere, came out of Alabama and controlled the nation's food supply chains. Fresh fruit, vegetables, and meat flowed through him, giving him leverage that stretched from New Orleans to Trafficante's Florida crew, Lucchese's Garment District rackets, Russell Bufalino's Pennsylvania network, and even the Massachusetts syndicates. They called him the Don between Dons. Then there was Joseph Riccobono, an old-timer whose family name would later be tied to the Colombian cocaine pipeline, from Pablo Escobar down to Barry Seal. Inside the family, Gambino leaned on blood. Gaspare Gambino stayed on the straight side, but Paul Castellano expanded Carlo's control over meat, fish, liquor, beer, and fine wines, everything that moved across New York's tables. And there was Paolo Gambino, Carlo's brother. Paolo wasn't a decision-maker, but he carried Carlo's messages and, by extension, his weight. On September 24, 1963, cops tailed him through the Bronx. They couldn't get him on racketeering, so they nailed him on traffic violations. But under his car seat, they found $2,941 in cash, with another $176 in his wallet. Paolo told them he was just a butcher hauling money to the bank. The cops didn't buy it, but it didn't matter. The best they could do was reckless driving and a $500 bail. His real work was as Carlo's courier, moving information and cash across the 5 boroughs. Paolo's record stretched back to 1929. In 1948, he did time for bootlegging. By the late 50s, he was moving into the kind of mob racket that looked legitimate on the surface. In 1959, he launched Butcher Tools Corp., a knife-sharpening business. Within months, butcher shops and chain groceries across New York City were dropping their old contracts and renting knives from him. The blades weren't sharp, the service was lousy, but the customers never complained. The Gambino name did the work. By the time the state caught on, legitimate grinders had lost nearly $500,000 in business. In 1962, a group of them pooled money and bought Paolo out for $175,000 just to get him out of the business. The scam was classic Cosa Nostra: penetrate a legitimate industry, choke competitors with fear, and then sell the exit like goodwill. When Paolo was hauled before the State Commission of Investigation in 1969, he played it like a grandfatherly butcher in a tweed suit, pleading the fifth over and over, while his son, Frank Ferro, did the same. Behind him was Salvatore Guglielmini, a Gambino soldier tied into the racket. But Paolo's moves didn't stop at knives. By the 1970s, his name was popping up across the border. On May 4, 1970, Canadian police spotted him at a Holiday Inn outside Toronto with his driver, Emanuele Adamita. The big man was in town. That night, Rocco Zito, a convicted bootlegger, and Giuseppe Indelicato, a convicted heroin smuggler, slipped in through the back door for a meeting. By morning, Paolo and Adamita were shadowing a truck out to a Little Italy business, moving through Toronto's mob neighborhoods before driving to Niagara Falls and slipping back into the States. Canadian cops knew why he was there, but kept it under wraps. The Gambino name carried into the next generation. Thomas Gambino, Carlo's nephew, became a power in his own right. By the 1980s, Gambino-linked food companies were muscling into the restaurant supply business. In Virginia, investigators found at least 3 mob-tied distributors, Roma Food Enterprises, Vasaturo Cheese, and Ferro Foods Corp., all carving up the pizza market. Roma was run by Louis Piancone out of New Jersey, but its enforcer was Salvatore Profaci, son of the late Joe Profaci and member of the Colombo family. He handled threats and labor disputes to keep rivals in line. Vasaturo Cheese, tied to Antonio Vasaturo and Vincent Lanzetta, opened shops in Virginia under Crotone Inca Ferro Foods, bigger and closer to home, was run by Paolo's son and sons-in-law. Frank Ferro, Carlo D'Arpa, and Francis Gambino, Paolo's boy, ran Ferro Foods from Brooklyn, moving $7 million a year in cheese and pizza supplies from Virginia to Maine. Investigators tied Roma and Ferro back to the Falcone brothers, mobsters linked to fraud schemes that looted cheese co-ops across Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota. At the heart of it all was Grande Cheese, a Wisconsin dairy born out of Chicago gang wars of the 1930s, with roots to Joe Bonanno and Al Capone's old crew. Whoever controlled mozzarella controlled pizza, and by the 70s and 80s, the mob had taken its cut from every pie ordered in the United States. Carlo Gambino's empire wasn't just built on the streets. It was built in butcher shops, warehouses, and pizza parlors. The knives, the cheese, the trucks, it all looked legitimate. But behind it was Cosa Nostra, and every dollar traced back to the family. Carlo Gambino said goodbye to Lucky Luciano with the quiet reverence of a disciple. Luciano was the model, sharp, disciplined, untouchable. Gambino admired him, studied him, and carried him like a shadow in his own rise. But while one giant of the underworld drifted into exile and age, another was reaching the end of his run. Joseph Profaci. Giuseppe Joe the Old Man. Profaci wasn't flashy. He wasn't theatrical. He was a survivor. A Sicilian transplant who weathered the bloodbath of the Castellamarese War, a 14-month shooting gallery that left 100 gangsters dead and reshaped organized crime in America. When it ended in 1931, New York belonged to the 5 families: Profaci, Luciano, Bonanno, Mangano, and Galliano. Profaci carved out his empire in Brooklyn. Gambling, shylocking, narcotics. He kept it steady, profitable, low profile. He was on the ground floor when the commission was created, a charter member at the table. But his quiet image took a hit in 1957 when state troopers stumbled onto the Appalachian meeting. Profaci and his underboss and brother-in-law Joe Magliocco were rounded up with scores of other bosses, their names splashed across front pages. A year later, the Senate Rackets Committee put him on display. Robert Kennedy went after him hard, mocking his broken English, reminding the room that Profaci had spoken more clearly in private the day before. But on the stand, the old man didn't budge. Question after question about Appalachian, about his daughter's marriages, about his olive oil front, his clothing business, his union ties, even murder conspiracies. Profaci had the same answer. I declined to answer. He turned the hearing into a one-man wall of silence. By 1962, cancer cut him down. From his house on a wooded hill in Holmdel, Salvatore J. Profaci could almost see where it all started. Sandy's Italian and American grocery store in Keensburg. Out of that corner shop grew Roma Food Enterprises, a multi-million-dollar supplier to pizzerias and restaurants across 28 states, run from a warehouse in South Plainfield. Most days, Profaci drove down Telegraph Hill Road to his office at Roma. Sometimes he did it in a blue Cadillac with the Roma 2 plates. A small show of style for a man who otherwise kept low. Neighbors barely knew him. His home, built in the early 70s, was hidden in the trees, cut off from view. Reporters who tried to reach him were met with silence. But keeping quiet didn't stop law enforcement from circling. Roma Food, investigators said, wasn't just a food supplier. Its dominance came from muscle. Competitors claimed threats, strong-arm tactics, and labor settlements that tilted every deal. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission even listed Profaci as an enforcer and full-time consultant for the company. When Roma tried to move into Atlantic City's casino industry, regulators blocked them. Roma wasn't his only play. Profaci also ran Eastern States marketing in Matawan, pitched himself as a business consultant, had interests in the boxboard trade, and once worked in a family importing business still operated by his brothers. But investigators weren't buying the consultant line. To them, he was more than a businessman. He was heir apparent to one of New York's 5 families. The New Jersey State Police named him a capo regime in the Colombo family. They said his crew gambling, shylocking, arson, extortion, and rackets tied to labor. By 1977, he had formally moved up to capo, using the same managerial skills that made Roma grow. Officially, Roma's president was Louis Piancone, a Holmdel neighbor. But police pointed out the irony. Piancone was a soldier in the Colombos, which meant on paper he answered to Profaci, the consultant working under him. Through Roma, the Colombos had built close ties with the Bonanno family. It was more than business. It was blood. Profaci's uncle, Joseph the Old Man Profaci, had been a boss and close ally of Joe Bonanno. That relationship was sealed in 1956, when Profaci's niece, Rosalie, married Salvatore Bill Bonanno. The wedding was a Mafia state affair. 3,000 guests packed the Astor Hotel, Tony Bennett sang, and gifts hit $100,000. The only bigger wedding that year was Grace Kelly's in Monaco. But behind the spectacle was the same paranoia that haunted every Don. Rosalie didn't even know her father was a boss, or that her new father-in-law was too. The Mafia feared exposure most of all, not the cops, but the spotlight. Publicity meant investigations, wiretaps, kids being mocked at school. Your father's a gangster. Families would cut articles out of newspapers before the children could see. The Bonanno-Profaci bond went deep. The elder Bonanno, like many bosses, had fled Mussolini's purge of the Mafia in Sicily, only to see it reborn in America under Prohibition. By the 30s and 40s, men like Bonanno and Profaci were millionaires with houses in the suburbs, real estate holdings, and children in college. But that prosperity carried a cost. The second generation, the Rosalies and Bills, lived between two worlds. Bill Bonanno, educated at the University of Arizona, marched with ROTC, dated blonde co-eds, and resisted the Mafia life. But in the end, he honored his father, as Gay Talese later put it, and became consigliere. He modernized the family with bell codes and front companies, but he was never made for it. His life became one of waiting in safe houses, smoking too much, overeating, wasting time behind closed shades. Eventually he went down not for murder or extortion, but for a petty credit card case that would have been a slap on the wrist for anyone else. By then the Mafia was already cracking. The discipline that had kept it alive was fraying. Soldiers were turning down jobs because they wanted to spend evenings with their wives. The FBI was listening. The press was hammering. And the kids who had once been shielded from the truth were seeing it in print. For Salvatore J. Profaci, though, the name still carried weight. His father, the Old Man, had built one of the original 5 families. Salvatore was determined to bring the Colombo family back to that level. Whether he could or not, Roma Food was the empire that gave him the cash, the reach, and above all, the cover. Joe Bonanno, the old boss from Brooklyn, still had reached. His ties stretched into the pizza business, through Grande Cheese of Wisconsin and into Roma Food. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission reported that Roma was Grande's exclusive distributor in southern New Jersey and Pennsylvania. But business wasn't the only thing linking Bonanno and Roma. The families were tied by blood. Joseph, the Old Man, Profaci, and Bonanno had been close associates for decades. Their friendship cemented when Profaci's niece Rosalie married Bonanno's son Salvatore Bill Bonanno. 2 of Salvatore J. Profaci's own sisters also married into mob families. Rosalie to Anthony Zerilli, son of Detroit boss Joseph Zerilli, and Carmela to Anthony Tocco, son of William Black Bill Tocco. After Joseph Zerilli's death, Jack Tocco, Anthony's brother, rose as Detroit's underworld boss. The Profacis had always straddled 2 worlds, food and the mob. Joseph Profaci Sr. ran Sunshine Shortening Corp., and Mamma Mia olive oil. Sunshine, originally a Brooklyn outfit, moved to Edison, New Jersey in 1976. The companies merged, with Joseph Jr. taking over as president and John J. as secretary-treasurer. Salvatore J. and his brother Dominic resigned from Sunshine in 1975 to focus on Roma Foods. Dominic practiced law out of an office at the Roma complex. Their brother Joseph J. kept a smaller venture, the Mamma Mia Pizzeria in Homedale Village. The family's Jersey roots went back to 1932, when Joseph Profaci Sr. bought a farm in Millstone. He called it a hunting lodge and entertained priests and nuns there. His sister was a nun herself. By 1960, he turned the property over to Rosalia Properties, Inc., run by his nephew Salvatore Fat Sal Profaci Jr. Fat Sal was Rosalia's brother, making him Bill Bonanno's brother-in-law. He died of a heart attack in 1978 at 43. His father, Salvatore Sr., had been killed in a 1954 boat explosion in Belmar. Fat Sal married into another mobbed-up family. His wife, Emily, was the daughter of Joseph Whitey Danzo, a labor leader tied to Simone, Sam the plumber de Cavalcante, New Jersey's boss. Danzo was notorious for selling labor peace to contractors. Pay him, and the strikes vanished. In 1977, Salvatore J. Profaci himself mediated a dispute between Danzo and Robert Bobby Basile Occhipinti, a de Cavalcante associate connected to the slain Anthony Little Pussy Russo. The argument centered on housing contracts through JRH Electric. Profaci sided with Danzo and shut it down. The year before, he handled another labor fight at Lisanti Foods in Totowa. 8 truck drivers threatened to unionize. Profaci showed up, according to the Crime Commission, and warned them off. He worked with a Teamsters agent from Local 560, Tony Pro Provenzano's local. Tony Pro, already under suspicion in the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance, dominated the union. Soon after, Lisanti became the sole distributor for Sunshine Shortening, while Roma Foods secured exclusive supply rights. Not every Profaci stayed so careful. In 1982, cousin Salvatore Sally Curtis Profaci was indicted for burglarizing the home of Joseph Lisanti in West Paterson. The job netted $83,000 cash and jewelry. State police had already pegged Sally Curtis as running narcotics for the Profaci faction in Ocean County. He'd been caught up in a methamphetamine case linked to an escort service doubling as a front for gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution. A failed nightclub singer with a taste for Atlantic City, he got his nickname chasing a career as Sal Curtis before drifting into the rackets. The Pianconis, Roma's other power line, weren't clean either. Michael Piancone, brother of Roma's CEO Louis, had been charged in California with heroin conspiracy alongside Gambino soldier Salvatore Solena. He beat the case in 1982, but state police still listed him as a Gambino soldier. Louis, meanwhile, kept building Roma. He bought Sandy's grocery in Keensburg in 1966, turned it wholesale by 1972, incorporated Roma in 1973, and opened the South Plainfield warehouse in 1974. In 5 years, the company expanded to Dallas and Jacksonville, running everything in cash and locking down 650 accounts across its territory. Authorities said success came from threats. Roma allegedly financed start-up pizzerias with mob loans, tightened its grip with arson and intimidation, and stiffed New Jersey on sales tax since 1966. Its attempted entry into Atlantic City casinos failed when the Gaming Commission refused to license them. Yet the company kept growing. By 1983, it was planning an 86,000-square-foot warehouse and offices in Piscataway, dropping $100,000 into local roadwork and even asking the town to rename Sanford Street as Roma Boulevard. Salvatore J. Profaci wasn't stopping there. He had his hands in wastepaper, recycling, aiming to corner the cardboard industry the way Roma controlled cheese and tomatoes. Law enforcement said the plan was simple: a Profaci monopoly over pizza and boxboard across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. When you study the history, really go through the articles, the reports, the bureau files, you see the picture for what it is. The government knew, the FBI knew, the press knew. The idea that nobody understood organized crime until Bobby Kennedy came along is a myth. They understood plenty. They just didn't act. Hoover sat on his hands, not because he was bought and paid for, not because he didn't care about crime. He was too busy chasing communists, riding the wave of the Red Scare, running point on civil rights. And there was another reason. The mob had him boxed in. They knew his secrets. They had dirt. He couldn't hit them without risking himself. Robert Kennedy wasn't built that way. He didn't care what you knew or what you held over him. He came at you straight. His target was clear. The mob, wherever it lived, whatever it touched. But Bobby didn't realize what he was up against. Dulles had turned the CIA into a machine Frankenstein built out of half a dozen intelligence outfits. A decade in, the agency was bigger than the Kennedys knew. It had tentacles everywhere, and its top brass were devout Catholics with ties to Christian Zionists. They weren't going to bend because Bobby wanted to clean house. So Kennedy turned to the weapons he did have. Newspapers, headlines, a Justice Department that could lean on Hoover's men when it had to. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and the mob bled in the papers before it bled in the courts. By the summer of 1963, Joe Valachi was ready to break omertà and tell the country how the Mafia worked from the inside. For the first time, a guy was going to rat out the whole structure. The timing was perfect. Just 1 year earlier, the Daily News ran a story that looked like pulp, but was all too real. A new kind of execution tool was making the rounds in New York: the hydraulic press. You'd find it in any junkyard. 12 feet high, with steel walls and rams that hit with 1 million pounds of pressure, designed to crush junk cars into cubes for the mills. But in the right hands, it became a murder weapon. The crush-out. Here's how it worked. A victim was lured into his car, maybe shot, maybe strangled, the old way. The body stayed in the trunk. The car went to a friendly yard. A crane dropped it into the press. Seconds later, it was a steel cube, 3 feet high, 36 inches wide, 24 across. Then it was coated, shipped to a mill, and thrown into the blast furnace. By the time it came out the other end as raw steel, every clue, every tooth, every bullet, every fingerprint was gone. The press was cleaner than any gun, any rope, any knife, and the numbers backed it up. Since 1960, New York had racked up 38 known or presumed mob hits. 20 of those men had simply disappeared. Squillante, Bender, Joe Jelly. They all went down that way. Presumed dead, the papers said. Nobody, no crime, no problem. Chicago was still old school. 33 kills in the same period, 15 in 1 year alone. The bloodiest stretch since Capone. Bodies in cars, bodies in alleys. The cops couldn't ignore it. New York, guys just vanished. But the calm was an illusion. Everyone knew the peace wouldn't hold. The gallows were restless. Profaci was on his deathbed. He finally beat the odds, dying in bed of cancer in March '62. One of the richest mobsters in America, worth maybe $50 million. The nation's olive oil king, with his hands in every racket that mattered. His death was the spark. The question was, who would wear the crown? Whoever it was, it would face enemies on all sides. The gallows were broke and hungry. Small crews wanted to go in. But, standing between them and the empire, were 3 forces. The NYPD's Brooklyn South detectives under red-haired Ray Martin, The Central Investigation Bureau, under John Shanley, the department's quiet intelligence arm, and above them all, the Commission, the mob's own high court. When the gallows fortified their President Street clubhouse, turning it into a dormitory with cots, rifles, and wire mesh windows, Martin's men formed a moving cordon around 9 blocks of South Brooklyn. Bulletproof vests, checkpoints, 24-hour patrols. The invasion never came. The cops learned Profaci and the gallows had cut a deal, and the vigil ended. But the cops knew and the mob knew that a new war was only one bad move away. June 13th, 1962. New York was waking up to summer when the headlines hit like a thunderclap. At a little Brooklyn social club, an old-timer sat in the corner with his coffee, muttering half in Sicilian, half in English. He slapped the paper. Criminals on the loose. Streets ain't safe. 3 men busted out of Alcatraz. Can you believe it? The Daily News headline screamed, "The Jinx flee from Alcatraz." 3 bank robbers, John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Lee Morris, had spent months digging through 4 inches of prison wall with sharpened spoons. They vanished before dawn, maybe on a raft cobbled from driftwood. If they made it across the bay alive, it would be the first successful escape in the Rock's 28 years. Cops, Coast Guard cutters, and military police swarmed San Francisco Bay, checking caves, combing Angel Island. The country was riveted. But across town, Carlo Gambino and his crew skimmed right past the Alcatraz story. What caught their eye was what sat across from it on the page. Photos of Joe Bonanno, Vito Genovese, and Mike Miranda. Another Daily News expose, this time shining a light on the Commission. The paper laid it out. The NYPD's Central Investigation Bureau, working out of 400 Broome Street, kept about 400 dossiers on mobsters. Green cabinets filled with updates from tipsters, shadows, and undercover guys. But those 400 names weren't just any wise guys. They were the top tier, the elite, the men who made up the Commission, organized crime's Supreme Court. The old board of directors setup of the 30s was gone. No more clean territorial splits. Now it was a loose confederacy, bosses dipping into rackets wherever the money was, Brooklyn into Manhattan, Manhattan into Queens. Captains ran their own crews beneath them, 80 men apiece, from hangers-on, fetching coffee, to the muscle and torpedoes, waiting for a chance to move up. The police chart ran like this. Manhattan, still Vito Genovese's turf, even from prison. Word was, Tony Bender-Strollo ran things for him until he vanished, probably a victim of the crush-out. His replacement, Tommy Ryan Eboli. Brooklyn, Carlo Gambino, the quiet mover, now the borough's biggest power after Profaci died of cancer in March. Queens, Tommy Lucchese, 3-Finger Brown, roots in East Harlem, still climbing. The Bronx, Vincent Arlo, Jimmy Blue Eyes. No Blue Eyes and more time in Florida than the Bronx, but still a player. Profaci had been on the Commission. Genovese, too, even from Atlanta Penitentiary. Together, along with Gambino and Lucchese, they formed the panel that sanctioned every major move. The rules were simple. No hits without Commission approval. Murders only for double crosses, self-defense, infidelity, squealing, or raiding protected rackets. Money beefs were off-limits, had to be worked out without blood. But even those rules bent under pressure. Profaci himself had once pleaded self-preservation on a money-related rue-bout, and walked free. When a hit did get the green light, it had to be clean, quiet. That's where the crush-out came in. No body, no crime, just a missing person report. Cops and feds got no heat. The business kept moving. The news pointed straight at Tony Bender-Strollo. He'd been Genovese's point man in Manhattan, ran the rackets, watched squirrels in the park when he wasn't moving envelopes. He also started stepping on the wrong toes. The commission voted. The hit was on. Out of respect, they even sent an envoy into Atlanta Penitentiary to ask Vito himself. He gave the nod. Strollo disappeared. Police said it was the press, crushed, melted, gone. The article made another point. The mob wasn't just in vice anymore. They were in the garment trade, vending machines, businesses that looked clean but weren't. A garment factory might be legit on paper, but its salesmen leaned on customers with threats and smiles. Vending outfits forced stores to dump rival machines. The line between legal and illegal blurred until it hardly mattered. The overt rackets were still there: gambling, extortion, narcotics, shylocking. But even those changed. The old $5,000 contracts for a rube-out were fading. Killers wanted equity now. A piece of the numbers, a slice of the bookmaking. Social security, one cop called it. And when someone tested the system, like Richard Langone and James Rocerto, who knocked over a string of bookies, the response was brutal. Their bodies turned up hacked apart with an ice chopper, left for everyone to see. A warning. By the summer of '62, with Profaci dead, the gallows circling, and the commission under a spotlight, the city felt primed for war. The cops hoped the commission would keep order. The question was, did anyone have the guts to defy it? The third hit wasn't a hit at all. It was a headline. Joseph Profaci, dead in bed, cancer. One of the last old-timers to leave the stage without a bullet or a blade. By then the roll call of ghosts was long. Charlie Luciano, gone. The Mangano brothers, gone. Thomas Galliano, gone. Anastasia, gone. Willie Moretti, gone. Bugsy Siegel, Longy Zwillman, Augie Carfano, gone. Joe Adonis, exiled. Now Profaci joined them. What was left were the men who'd learned to outlive the noise. Frank Costello was still around, older, sick, chased by taxmen. The surprise was his prison truce with Vito Genovese. They'd buried the hatchet when they crossed paths inside. Vito made sure Frank had money. Frank made sure Vito got the best medical care he could reach behind bars. Genovese would die of cancer in '69. Meyer Lansky endured, flanked by Mike Miranda and his brother-in-arms, Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Allo. Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese, together since the '20s, were now the quiet axis in New York. Beyond them stood Russell Bufalino, Angelo Bruno, Sam Giancana, Tony Accardo, Paul Rica, Carlos Marcello, Santo Traficante Jr., and Alan Dorfman. The constellation of men who didn't need introductions. The new board in New York looked different. Tommy Lucchese ran lean and smart. Joseph Magliocco stepped into the vacuum after Profaci. Genovese, even caged, ruled through fronts and proxies. Consigliere Mike Miranda, Gerardo Catena, the only man who touched Vito's money, Tommy Ryan Eboli and his brother Pat, Trigger Mike Coppola, James Jimmy Napoli, Ralph Polizzano, Frank Funzi Thierry, John Dotto, Pasquale Eboli. On paper, they were captains. In practice, their fiefdoms were big enough to look like separate countries. Gambino took the old Mangano Anastasia machine and made it calm and profitable. And Joe Bonanno watched from the sidelines, convinced the chair at the head of the table should be his now that Luciano and Profaci were gone. Bonanno read the room and didn't like the cast. He saw Gambino and Lucchese consolidating. He felt crossed when Carmine Galante got put away. The streets drifted toward Genovese and Gambino's people. Carlo played his part without leaving prints. Bonanno had friends inside the Genovese family, Tommy Eboli among them, and enough reach to make himself believe. But his flaw was public. Chicago didn't trust him. New York thought he believed his own press. Profaci had always made it easy to misread him. Square jaw, tortoise-shell glasses, salt and pepper hair, a slight limp from a boiler explosion, on a ship he took back from a Cleveland Mafia council raid in 1928, the long way home through the Panama Canal to stay off the radar. With his own men, he was cold and distant. With cops, he melted into a pleading nobody, the kind of act that made detectives roll their eyes. He built an empire and hid it behind a brick house at 8863 15th Avenue in Bath Beach, a Cadillac 2 years old, church on Sundays at St. Bernadette's, generous envelopes for the sacristy, a nickel tipper everywhere else. He lived like an underworld millionaire who preferred the blinds drawn. His paper trail was thin by design. First arrested in Italy in 1917 for theft and attempted rape, beat it. Later, a horse theft bit, did a year. By the late 20s, he was in Brooklyn, married, already moving with the right crowd. He was scooped at Appalachian in '57, said nothing, faded back into the wallpaper. The Senate probers got little. The veil only started to lift when a policy banker named Frankie Shots Abatimarco got murdered in 1959. 5 shots on the sidewalk, 3 more in the bar where he staggered to die. Abatimarco had been staked by Profaci, paid a weekly tax, then hit a bad run and asked for time. The answer was no. The masked shooter, cops learned, was a Gallo hand working for hire. When Anthony Abbey Abatimarco, Frankie's son and a Gallo man, heard it, there was no street theatre and no vendetta. In their world, a workman did his work. The Gallos were already doing muscle jobs for Profaci. They took the practical route and moved to seize Frankie's policy bank and refused to pay Profaci's tax. The response was predictable. Death warrants whispered through Brooklyn. The Gallos struck first. They kidnapped Profaci's brother Frank, his brother-in-law Joe Magliocco, and strong-arm Salvatore Musacchio, warehoused them in hotel rooms and called in terms, call off the hits, negotiate the rackets. Profaci agreed. The hostages walked, and he reneged immediately. By the summer of '60, Joe Jelly Gioielli, Larry Gallo's bodyguard, kissed his wife goodnight, got into his air-conditioned '59 Cadillac, and vanished. 2 weeks later, his clothes turned up outside a Gallo bar with a dead fish, dumped at sea. Days after that, somebody tried to strangle Larry in a Brooklyn bar. War was on the table. It didn't happen only because Assistant Chief Inspector Raymond Martin's Brooklyn South detectives and the hush-hush Central Investigation Bureau under John Shanley put a ring of steel around 51 President Street, the Gallo dormitory rigged with wire screens, cots, shotguns, and scoped rifles. For months, cops in bulletproof vests circled 9 blocks, car by car, stopping everything that looked wrong. Even so, the bloodletting might have gone quiet and steady if the Gallos hadn't gone to the commission. They made a clean argument. Profaci had violated the cardinal rule, no murders over money. The commission convened in a Nassau County restaurant basement, never the same place twice. Profaci, a member himself, had to step down and take the defendant's chair. He said it wasn't money, said Frankie Shots had hired torpedoes to kill him, said it was self-defense. The commission bought it, barely, and ordered peace with the Gallos. Profaci sent an emissary, signed terms, and ignored them. That left the same question after Profaci's funeral that had been floating for months. Do the Gallos sit still, or does somebody make a grab? By then the map had shifted anyway. Gambino ran the old Anastasia machine with a light touch. Lucchese had Queens and East Harlem lines humming. Genovese, sick but still casting a shadow, ruled by remote. Miranda, Catena, the Ebolis, Trigger Mike, Jimmy Knapp, Thierry, Polizzano, Dotto, captains in name, bosses in posture. And Joe Bonanno stood outside the circle, convinced the top chair should slide his way, surrounded by men who didn't share the conviction. The commission didn't just issue rulings, it kept the lights low and the noise down. Murders needed clearance. Bodies were bad for business. When blood had to be spilled, it was done with minimum fuss. Sometimes that meant the crush-out, the car, the corpse, the hydraulic press, a cube of metal on a truck to a mill. No body, no crime, no heat. Tony Bender Strollo, once Genovese's Manhattan steward, learned that the hard way. He watched squirrels in parks and carried Vito's envelopes, until he stepped on the wrong toes. The commission voted. An envoy visited Atlanta to ask Vito's opinion. Approval came back. Strollo disappeared. By the time the ink dried on the Profaci obituaries, only a handful of men could still pick up a phone and move a city. They used the commission to keep the peace, police units to keep the lid down, and headlines to confuse the public. The old world had died in a dozen funerals. The new one ran on rules that weren't written down, enforced by men who smiled while they tightened the screws. And everyone understood the math. You didn't need to love the man at the head of the table. You just had to obey him. When gangsters fall, doors open. When the government goes after them, whole avenues appear. Opportunity in the shadows, killers waiting in the mist. The Italians had it good for a long time, but the ground was shifting. New players, blacks, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, were crowding into the rackets. Organized crime wasn't staying in the neighborhood anymore. Luciano had ruled from the top from 1932 to 1936, and even from prison, he pulled the strings until 1946. He had a way of keeping things under control. He told the bosses, "Don't get greedy, don't eye another man's rackets. Spread the wealth, keep your guys happy, give them a piece of something they could build on." He believed greed would be the Mafia's undoing. But Luciano didn't stay. Deportation took him out of America before he could finish his vision. What came after him were hungrier men, unstable, less disciplined. Betrayal became the currency of New York. Gambino saw it. He could feel something was coming, but what he didn't know was that it had already started. By the early 60s, the streets were restless. Gangsters were threatening the bosses. Kidnappings were happening in daylight. Stash spots were being raided. Ransom became a new racket. And overseas, the war machine was feeding the streets. Young black soldiers, shipped off to Vietnam, were coming back with connections to Southeast Asian traffickers. The next drug wave, pure heroin, straight from the source, was on its way, and it was going to strangle New York. That much cash floating around, warehouses stuffed with dope, apartments stacked with payoff money, meant something inevitable. Predators, men who saw the mob itself as prey. George Ferraco was one of the first casualties. Born and raised in East Harlem, Ferraco lived in the junk trade. He started stealing at 17, armed robbery, burglary, counterfeiting, and eventually graduated to heroin. Montreal to buy, Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago to sell. He did time twice on federal narcotics raps. By the time he walked out of Atlanta Penitentiary in 1959, he was back in the neighborhood, back in business. On May 31st, 1962, he stepped out of his Pleasant Avenue apartment to buy a newspaper. He felt safe there. Pleasant was a white enclave, a Mafia stronghold, 9 blocks packed tighter with mob guys than anywhere else in America. He was unarmed. 2 strikes on his record meant another gun pinch would bury him. Halfway down the block, a blue Buick pulled up. 2 sharp-dressed men got out. One flashed a police badge, the other pressed a revolver into Ferraco's stomach. He thought it was just another bust, so he climbed in without a fight. It wasn't the cops. It was a contract. Ferraco was hauled to a Bronx apartment. A small man in horn-rimmed glasses explained the deal. "We got a contract on you. But maybe we can make a trade. Your life, for names faced with death." Ferraco broke Omerta. He spilled everything he knew: drug dealers, bookies, card operators, dice men, anyone with cash in their pockets and a target on their backs. The man wrote it all down. When Ferraco had nothing left to give, they shot him in the head, stuffed his body into a 50-gallon oil drum, and buried it on a farm upstate. His words didn't die with him. They gave birth to something new. The crew that used his list became Kidnap, Inc., a gang unlike anything New York had seen. They started small, snatching dope dealers, holding them for ransom. Nobody talked. Victims paid up and kept quiet, terrified their bosses or the cops would learn how much untaxed cash they had stashed. It worked. They hit a dozen dealers without a leak. Then they got bold. They went after capos, men in the Mafia caste system who thought themselves untouchable. The kidnappers didn't care. The captains paid cash to get free, too humiliated to admit what happened. Every one of them was tied to narcotics, something they didn't want the commission or the feds digging into. The mob's communication gaps worked in Kidnap Inc.'s favor. Bosses talked to bosses. Underbosses and capos talked to each other. But soldiers rarely knew what the next crew was doing, and nobody confessed to losing face. That silence kept the kidnappers invisible. What made Kidnap Inc. unique was its makeup. It was integrated: black, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and white ex-cons, mostly stick-up men who met in prison. They figured there was more money in grabbing mafiosi than in knocking over candy stores. They used their mix as cover. Black and Spanish guys kidnapped Italians. The white guys handled black and Puerto Rican targets. For a while it worked. And it terrified the Mafia because the hunters had become the hunted. On November 10th, 1952, the papers lined up their shot at Tommy Lucchese. The headline said it plain: the successor to Frank Costello, not on the street, but in politics. Costello had been the gold standard for connections, FBI men on a first-name basis. Police Commissioner Thomas Murphy, in his book, The Mayor on Speed Dial, favors moving from City Hall to Washington. He'd made the front of time in 1949 for a reason. He was one of the most powerful fixers on earth. But he wasn't alone. Joe Adonis had deep political roots too, until his past caught up with him, and immigration closed the door. And Lucchese, quiet, stocky, the businessman, was rising fast, inheriting unions after Dutch Schultz and Lepke Buchalter went down. Those rackets would later drift toward Carlo Gambino, but the moment belonged to Tommy. The November 10th piece by Ed Reed and Neil Patterson put Lucchese under a floodlight. Three Finger Brown, 52, ex-con, reputed millionaire, a familiar name around murder files and club tables. Governor Dewey's State Crime Commission wanted to know if he was the new overlord of rackets-plagued Manhattan. Immigration was circling too. Denaturalize him, deport him. 2 years earlier, State Industrial Commissioner Edward Corsi had accused mayoral candidate Vincent Impellitteri of riding support from Three Finger Brown, whom he identified as Thomas Lucchese. Impellitteri shot back. Never heard of Three Finger, knew Lucchese as a respectable businessman. Rudolph Halley, fresh off the Senate Crime Committee and now council president, went further. With Costello jailed, Lucchese had taken over Manhattan's rackets. The news dug in. There were dinners, Al Smith Memorial Foundation, Friendly Sons of St. Patrick, where the little ex-convict showed up at the right tables with judges, congressmen, and former Supreme Court justices. Official plates idled outside his home nights and weekends. Treasury looked into whether his real estate deals had off-record partners with influence. Phone traces showed calls from his house to Frank Costello and to Willie Moretti before Moretti's execution by his own people. And when Italian police frisked Lucky Luciano after courier Charles Truppier was caught in Rome with cocaine, they found a list in Lucky's pockets. Tommy Brown, with the Benti Venger's restaurant address at 55 East Houston, one of Lucchese's haunts, alongside Willie Moretti, Joseph Biondo, Trigger, Mike Coppola, Joseph Profaci, Pasquale Massi, Gyp DeCarlo, Anthony the Chief Bonacera, Charles the Don Donguera, and Philip Mangano. Years earlier, on July 4, 1931, Cleveland police had collared Luciano, Biondo, and Lucchese together. The picture was consistent. Wherever power gathered, heroin routes, garment floors, political rooms, Lucchese's name kept surfacing. His paper past was equally busy. First pinch, October 2nd, 1921, Bay Shore, Long Island. Grand larceny. A $3,000 twin six-packard, 3 to 10 years at Sing Sing. He did 3. By July 1928, he was questioned for the murder of Louis Ceresulo, out in 6 days. In 1930, his Winebrick office partner, Joseph Pinzolo, was shot dead. Lucchese vanished, reappeared with Francis X. Mancuso, former judge, Tammany leader, later a real estate partner, and beat the homicide before a grand jury. In 1931, when Salvatore Maranzano got clipped at 230 Park Avenue, Tommy said he was just in the waiting room and saw nothing. A 1935 vagrancy arrest. A 1927 receiving stolen goods pinch. Dismissals. Nothing that stuck except the early auto theft. On paper, he was a businessman. Braunell Lentard, 253 West 37th Street. He was secretary-treasurer. Louis Kaufman was president. Joseph Logano was vice president, a man with a prior year-and-a-day narcotics conviction. Between 1942 and 1951, Lucchese reported $250,000 in income and $70,000 in taxes. Before and after, he drifted through every line that could cash flow a syndicate. Machinist, hat maker, dried fruit importer, pushing prohibition, wine bricks, window cleaning, hoisting equipment, construction, commercial contracting, real estate. He had a hand in the Casino de Paris with Billy Rose staging the shows. Partners included Rene Brown and Sammy Whitey Sperber, a known dope man. When competition crossed him, one partner said he'd box Doc Rats and let them loose on a rival's dance floor. The club collapsed. Rose later said Tommy and company still owed him $16,000. There was the King's Brewery bootleg alcohol play that died with repeal. They held out for too high a price and wound up with nothing. His right index finger? Blown off in a munitions plant toward the end of the Great War. He called himself a grocer when he took the Sing Sing hit in 2022. If you wanted the political side, he had that too. He'd dropped $2,000 into Bill O'Dwyer's 1949 campaign fund after the election. Corsi swore syndicate leaders met at Duke's restaurant in West New York in '49 to pick a mayor, Adonis Costello and Vito Genovese for Ferdinand Pecora, Lucchese for Impoliteri, only for O'Dwyer to jump back in and upset the plan. When O'Dwyer quit to be ambassador to Mexico, they split again along the same lines, Corsi said. Lucchese also worked the federal side, where favors mattered most to anyone touching narcotics routes. In March 1941, when narcotics boss George H. White and his agents blew through a window at Duke's Cliffside Park and hauled out 80 mob faces, Willie and Solly Moretti, Arthur Langano, Salvatore Archidiaco, Lucchese was at the table. He said he'd stopped in for coffee. They let him go. The articles named the man who opened doors for him downtown. Armand Chankalian, the $9,000 a year administrative assistant who effectively ran the U.S. courthouse for U.S. Attorney Miles J. Lane. Chankalian ran the building, the stenographers, and knew where every file lived. He ushered Tommy through banquets and introductions. The legitimate face of a garment manufacturer, Hotel Astor Records, showed rooms billed to Lucchese and transferred to Chankalian's tab. The I Never Take Vacations courthouse boss turned up on a Miami Beach trip in early 1949. Same hotel, same season, with Lucchese and a sitting city councilman. When Chankalian tried to introduce his friend Mr. Lucchese to a federal judge in Newark, the judge cut it short. "Get that man the hell out of this building." Judge Thomas Murphy, then police commissioner, later federal judge, had to explain all of this to the Senate Judiciary Committee. In a June 25, 1951, letter to Senator Alexander Wiley, he said he'd known Lucchese for 6 years, thought he was a straight 7th Avenue dressman, met him through Shankalian, saw him at public functions with respectable company. He'd been to Tommy's house. Tommy had been to his. Only in late 1950, while preparing Justice Department dossiers and then, as commissioner, did he read the NYPD slip? A 1921 felony, a string of arrests, dismissals, and the rest. He invited Lucchese to his table at the Friendly Sons of St. Patrick in 49 and, on paper, in 50, though a virus kept half the table home that year. The guest lists carried names: Jack Aaron, Armand Chankalian, Louis Coblentz, Leslie Kirsch, Edward or Edward W. MacDonald, James McInerney, Edward Rigney, Sol Wood, and Thomas Lucchese. Murphy swore he never broke bread with Lucchese and the mayor together, and that his own appointment as commissioner came over lunch with Impellitteri at Benti Venger's, 55 East Houston, with no one else at the table. By then, the government had started weaponizing paper. Luciano, tired of fighting headlines and press conferences from exile, had learned the hard way. If they can't jail you, they'll deport you. Costello, who had visited Lucky on the boat, now faced his own deportation threat after a contempt sentence. Immigration dangled the same blade over Lucchese. On April 19, 1950, the State Parole Board handed Tommy a certificate of good conduct, restoring his vote, a felon's ticket back into civic life. He hadn't mentioned that he'd already voted in Queens in 1944, signing a false residency statement. Usually, you needed 3 letters of recommendation for that certificate. In this case, records were thin. Verbal inquiries, the board said. A federal investigator later remembered seeing a letter in the file from Chankalian asking to appear on Tommy's behalf. When the news checked Albany, that letter wasn't there. Citizenship told the same story. Lucchese filed October 19, 1936, and got it January 25, 1943, in Newark. He disclosed the 1921 felony, but not 4 arrests, 2 homicides, beaten on dismissals. One federal source said omission alone wouldn't make it fraud, but clean living and avoiding evil companions were part of the standard. The record kept arguing with itself. A narcotics raid here with the wrong company, a courtroom table there with the right company. Meanwhile, the State Crime Commission dragged him in. 500 pages of preliminary testimony. He denied knowing the usual roll call of hoodlums. If counsel could prove lies, perjury indictments would follow. Halley, reached in Miami, said the Senate committee never put Lucchese on the stand because Corsi hadn't set the stage with proof. The committee had been swallowed whole by Costello. Halley turned his Lucchese file over to the state. If you talked to Lucchese's neighbors, you got a different picture. Lido Beach, Long Island. A yellow brick ranch at 74 Royat Street, 3 master bedrooms, a 20 by 40 living room, about $60,000. 10 extra lots stitched along the side and back, the shore a short walk away. Workers from a nearby housing project built it in their spare time. He paid cash, week by week. In Queens, he kept a year-round place at 106 Parsons Boulevard in Malba, owned since 1942. Before that, 6 years at 1093 Briar Way in Palisades, New Jersey. Limousines and official plates rolled up for parties. To neighbors, he was a good man to have next door. When a man on the block needed the Mayo Clinic and got told 3 months, Tommy picked up a phone. Ridiculous, he said. He called Rosie. An hour later, the sick neighbor had a slot for the next day. No one could explain it. Everyone remembered. The series ran 4 parts and kept coming. On November 15, 1952, the paper doubled back. More on Lucchese's operations, the same names, the same pressure points. From Sicily, Lucky read the clippings and seethed. He'd seen this movie. The establishment uses men like Costello and Lucchese when it suits them, then burns them when the politics change. Deportations if prison won't stick. Hearings if the deportation case is thin. Front-page headlines to finish the job. By then, the unions Lepke and Schultz had once held were sliding under Gambino's control, the next evolution in a line that ran from Tammany's Jimmy Hines through the garment floors to 7th Avenue showrooms and the loading docks. Lucchese kept moving. Banquets, courthouses, factories, dukes, Bentivengas, bridging the space between the back room and the front page, the politician's handshake and the narcotics man's phone call. The files told one story, the neighbors told another, and in between, the new American war, arrests if possible, deportations if necessary, ground on. February 3rd. Washington put a match to its own house. Attorney General Herbert Brownell pushed out Armand Chancalian, the $9,160 a year fixer who ran the courthouse machinery for U.S. Attorney Miles Lane, after Chancalian admitted under oath what insiders already knew. For 20 years he'd shepherded Tommy Three-Finger Brown Lucchese through rooms where only judges, senators, and clean shirts were supposed to sit. He'd tried to talk Governor Thomas Dewey into pardoning Lucchese back in 1949, took him to a West Point game with Lane, walked him into introductions with federal Judge Thomas Murphy and Judge Thomas Meany in Newark. Chancalian swore he never asked Meany for a favor and claimed he never grasped Tommy's rap sheet or the company he kept. Brownell didn't care. The message was simple. Justice was cutting daylight between itself and organized crime. April 7th. The Supreme Court handed the government a public slap. 5 years of denaturalization work against Frank Costello collapsed because the Justice Department blew a deadline. No affidavit of good cause, no case. With one ruling, the court kicked out the bid to strip citizenship not just from Costello, the Senate Crime Committee's most famous witness, but also from Gaetano Tommy Lucchese and Labor man James J. Martels. The ripple hit everything. The campaign launched under Attorney General James McGranary to denaturalize and deport foreign-born mob figures, and communists suddenly looked shaky. Lawyers started talking about the collateral damage, to pending cases involving men like Russell Bufalino, and whether others already chased to the docks might claw their way back. July 2nd. The racket hearings turned clinical. Senator John McClellan's committee, with Robert Kennedy riding shotgun, put the mechanics of Mafia murder on the record. Federal narcotics agent Martin Pera laid it out. Sicily had logged 14 executions since '53, garlic-smeared bullets to guarantee blood poisoning if the first shot didn't finish the job. Behind the gore was the business plan, drug routes braided into legitimate fronts, labor locals turned into cash machines. The Appalachian roll call surfaced again, a heroin mover like Pasquale Pagano doubling as a hod carrier's business agent, skirting the usual $400 longshore fee to sneak a kilo off a New York dock. Johnny Dio muscling toward Teamsters power. Olive oil, cheese, and pizza. Ingredients riding the same channels as heroin. The committee tried to pry open the code of silence and hit bedrock. Vito Genovese, yellow-tinted glasses, stone face, sat for 3 hours and invoked the fifth about 200 times. Michael Miranda followed suit and could barely read the script of his own refusal. Joe Profaci clammed up. John Scalish did the same. When Tommy Lucchese took the chair, he called himself a dress contractor, denied the Mafia, and lawyered every answer with the Constitution. Kennedy pressed him on a record that started with a 1921 Sing Sing bid for auto theft, brushed 2 homicide arrests that never stuck, and picked up a nickname, Three-Finger Brown, after an old munitions plant accident and a cop's sense of humor about the pitcher Mordecai Brown. Nothing moved him. McClellan burned publicly, and called for faster deportations, for foreign-born hoods who hid behind rights they wouldn't grant their victims. Then the spotlight swung west. McClellan said the first phase proved the point. The syndicate was laundering itself through unions and storefronts. Next up was Chicago. Restaurants, labor, the outfit's grip, with Tony Accardo expected in the box. The names read into the record ran to the hundreds, stitched by blood and business from coast to coast. Threaded through all of it was Lucchese's double life. On one side, his phone number turns up in the pockets of traffickers from Lucky Luciano in exile to small-time couriers on the coast. His name on hotel registers with courthouse brass. His introductions greased by Chancalian. On the other, a tax-paying executive seat at Braunell Limited, legitimate contracts on 7th Avenue, a reputation for getting things done, whether that meant a union vote going quiet or a hospital bed opening tomorrow instead of next month. The government tried to box him in with deportation when indictments wouldn't hold. The court reminded them procedure mattered as much as proof, and the Senate tried to smoke the family out with sunlight, only to watch the old oath do its work. Silence in public, business as usual in private. By summer of 1962, and the line was clear. Washington was done pretending its own intermediaries were innocent. Brownell's firing made that point. The Supreme Court forced prosecutors to do their homework before they reached for the passport. McClellan's crew mapped the arteries, garment floors, docks, locales, legit distributors that smelled like cheese on the invoice and heroin on the ledger. And Lucchese, successor to Costello in the political lanes whether he said it or not, kept moving along the seam where influence meets enforcement, watched by men who wanted him denaturalized, deposed, or simply to talk. He did none of the three. The headlines stacked up, the system adjusted, the syndicate adapted. The play continued. In the 1930s, Lucky Luciano finished drawing the new map of organized crime and did something that froze the room. He snapped his fingers, reached across the table, and shook Tommy Lucchese's hand like they'd known it was coming all along. In that instant, a quiet truth set in. Lucchese wasn't just another East Harlem operator. He was one of the most dangerous minds in New York, the legal brain inside the Galliano crowd who knew how to turn a racket into a business and a business into a fortress. Out of that handshake stepped a deeper alliance. Two Palermo-bred syndicates syncing up in the shadows. Carlo Gambino on one side, Tommy Lucchese on the other. Together they locked down the arteries of the city. Transportation, the garment center, meat and liquor, the produce markets. They didn't just skim. They set the prices, rigged the bids, and wrote the rules. Garbage, construction, plumbing, public work, coast to coast, they owned the bid sheets and buried the competition. What they built wasn't a partnership on paper. It was old country blood logic. Two houses fused into one that nobody could pry apart. Joe Bonanno read the move for what it was. If he wanted Gambino, he had to take Lucchese too, plus anyone else ready to bleed for them. The discontent was already crackling. Tommy Eboli was hot. Carmine Galante was steaming. Vincent Gigante had been pushed to the rail, and Vito Genovese's people had lost chairs at the table. Gambino and Lucchese had played quiet and smart, and by the time anyone looked up, the seats were gone, and the door was closed. Time did what time does. Thomas Gambino inherited a fortune, and in the 90s the old machine met a new kind of heat. September 12th, 1991. The Daily News runs a feel-good headline with sharp edges. Carlo Gambino's sons, Thomas and Joseph, donate more than $1 million to build a pediatric bone marrow transplant unit at Schneider Children's Hospital, Long Island Jewish Hillside. The hospital calls it gorgeous. The unit gets their name. Grace Kraskin, the spokeswoman, says thousands of kids will benefit. Dr. Philip Lanskowski, Chief of Staff, says it's the only children-only cancer centre in the metro area. 4 beds, sterile pressurised room, lab, pharmacy, space for parents, standard hospital gratitude. He adds they don't inquire from donors the source of their money. Law enforcement fills in the rest. Justice lists both brothers as members of the family now run by John Gotti. State charges say they strangled garment centre trucking with a cartel. Federal charges have Thomas riding shotgun with Gotti on racketeering. Their lineage speaks for itself. Father Carlo dead of natural causes in 1976 after building the nation's biggest family. Uncle Paul Castellano, boss of bosses. Thomas's father-in-law, Tommy Lucchese. Former Strikeforce Chief Edward MacDonald puts it flat. Tommy Gambino is a wealthy and affluent businessman and one of the most significant people in the Gambino crime family. Their lawyers, Michael Rosen for Thomas, Gerald Shargle for Joseph, call the donation clean, consistent with years of charity work. The hospital takes the check. February 5th, 1992. The velvet comes off the glove. In Manhattan Supreme, prosecutors paint Thomas and Joseph as velvet-gloved mobsters who run the garment center's trucking lanes with salesmen who don't sell. Elliot Spitzer tells the jury the brothers carved up the market, stifled competition, and collected for work they didn't do. The overcharge, he says, is a private tax that flows straight into their pockets. The indictment lists enterprise corruption, restraint of trade, extortion, grand larceny, coercion, 48 counts, 25 years on the line, forfeiture on top. Defense fires back. The business was built the old-fashioned way, relationships and service. Rosen promises no one will testify truthfully that Thomas threatened or extorted anyone. Tapes are coming, Spitzer says. The brothers sit stone still. May 2nd, 1993. The bill comes due, and it has a rebate. The plea the brothers entered in '92 ends their racketeering trial. They admit the cartel. They agree to get out. A court-appointed special master, former NYPD Commissioner Robert Maguire, forces them to sell their garment district routes within a year and join 2 other cartel truckers in a record $12 million fine. By Maguire's math, the routes are worth 1 year's gross, $14 million. Pay the fine in installments, 65% covered so far, about $7.8 million. And on paper, the brothers could clear more than $6 million when the last route is sold. Prosecutors bristle. Michael Cherkasky from Morgenthal's office calls any windfall talk bad math. The point, he says, was to end mob control, not to salt the earth. The revenue stream is gone, forever. The FBI still lists Thomas as a capo. He goes to trial in Brooklyn Federal Court for running a crew, gambling and loan sharking in Connecticut, while the sales grind on. On 7th Avenue, the brothers are still treated like serious businessmen who donate millions, never convicted before the garment case. And buyers line up anyway. Even clean operators in the district can pull gross margins in the 40 to 50% range. Alan Rubin of Conduit Rapid Delivery, who buys 6 routes, says the only thing that keeps accounts is service. It's the same as buying a restaurant. It's only some kind of goodwill that you're buying. On service, he says, the Gambinos were excellent. He adds without blinking, Thomas Gambino is one of the most honourable businessmen I have ever dealt with. There are still rules. Maguire rejects early buyers for sloppy books or thin capital. If you want to buy the routes, he says, you better be clean, because they're looking everywhere but in your underwear. The DA wants liquidation after the brothers miss a March 1st deadline. Assistant DA Barry Ginsberg accuses them in a letter to the judge of playing a lot of games, overpricing routes and floating unqualified buyers, including some with organised crime ties. Rosen denies it. Acting Justice Thomas Galligan grants a 90-day extension at Maguire's urging to finish the sales. That's how the story runs in this life. Luciano shook a hand and rewired the city. Gambino and Lucchese fused two Sicilian houses into one long play. Transport, garments, meat, liquor, fruit, the bids, the boards, the whole supply chain, and kept it quiet long enough to outlive most of their enemies. Bonanno saw it coming and couldn't stop it. Decades later, the empire still throws a shadow in the garment district. Only now the cut is taken in court. The routes move by court order, and the headlines read like charity galas and price-fixing sheets in the same breath. The faces change. The logic doesn't. By '62, the war on organized crime was heating up, and so was the secret war on Castro. Operation Mongoose was moving from talk to action. In the South, Florida through Louisiana, far-right operators and mob talent crossed streams. Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante were in the mix. So were Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Jack Ruby, Sergio Arcacha-Smith, John Martino, and Lauren Hall, part Mafia, part CIA, and all desperate to claw back the homes and cash they'd left in Cuba. The plan was simple. Destabilize Castro, break Cuban morale, flip the island. The Mafia knew exactly who sat on top of these operations, Attorney General Robert Kennedy. To them it felt like a double cross. One arm of the government squeezed them, the other used their roots and muscle against Havana. Carrot and stick at the same time, with the donkey headed for slaughter. It wasn't just New York feeling the heat. In Chicago, the new boss, Sam Giancana, took it personal and hard. RFK was becoming a national figure in his own right. He circled the globe early in '62, helped smash a steel price hike in April, forced James Meredith's admission to Ole Miss that fall, and stood inside the room during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October. But inside justice, his priority stayed fixed: organized crime. His list was short and lethal: Giancana, Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante. The FBI shadowed Giancana non-stop. In '61 they tracked his runs to Las Vegas, New York, Philly, most of it to see singer Phyllis McGuire. Bugs heard McGuire call him Sam, Momo, and Mr. Flood. In October, Chicago agents reported the IRS man on Sam's tax case wasn't pushing hard. Courtney Evans took it straight to RFK. Microphones also caught Jimmy Hoffa tipping Sam to an important meeting, and Giancana warning an Italian-American Pole to skip a Columbus Day event Robert Kennedy would attend. November into December, Sam and McGuire went long: London, Rome, Puerto Rico, while he scouted casino plays. In January, federal ears picked him musing about a Jamaica hotel and swearing about Columbus Day politics. December 8th, 1961, a bug caught him with Johnny Roselli, and the tape cut through a decade of rumor. Roselli pressed Sinatra's role. Had Frank interceded with the Kennedys? He pushed Sinatra to go through old Joe Kennedy, who'd been calling during Frank's visit. Sinatra shrugged it off, said the sons weren't faithful to their father's wishes. Roselli vented that Sinatra dreamed of an ambassadorship, paid and got nothing. Sinatra told Roselli he'd written Sam's name and brought it to Bobby, "This is my buddy," and got nowhere. Giancana laughed like the answer was obvious. The same report, J. Edgar Hoover moved it to RFK immediately, fed the legend that Sam felt betrayed after stealing 1960. The tape says something else. Yes, Sinatra took a campaign donation from Giancana. No, there's no evidence RFK owed Sam a thing, or that Sinatra even told him. Giancana raged that he wasn't getting his money's worth, that if he caught a speeding ticket, none of them would know him. Everywhere he went, he said, there were 20 guys next door, upstairs, downstairs. Chicago, New York, Phoenix, surrounded. A month later, in ward boss John Darko's bugged office, Sam compared a local politician named Spencer to the Kennedys. "He'll get what he wants out of you, but you won't get anything out of him." Darko cursed Kennedy and asked if Sinatra could help. "He can't get change of a quarter," Giancana said. "They've got the whip. They're in office, that's it. They're going to knock us out of the box and make us defenseless." In early January, Darko moaned that the campaign was nationwide. Kennedy was boasting, and the old political game was over. "We're supposed to be politicians, not hoodlums. So, what do we do?" By February 2nd, after the FBI's new tactic of grilling ward politicians about mob ties, Darko and Giancana were resigned. "We are through," Darko said. "There is no place to go." Giancana: "History repeats itself. I told everyone, they're on their own. Make a living, but you're on your own." Hoover didn't blink. On February 15th, 1962, he ordered Chicago to go all out, detail Giancana's violations and build a clean prosecution. 2 weeks later, Chicago sent back the menu, up to and including organized crime murders. At the same time, the press splashed Sam's romance with Maguire, and that same week, RFK learned of another web of romances linking Roselli, Giancana, and the president. Public heat on one side, federal pressure on the other. And beneath it, the covert war ran hot, with the same names showing up in Havana schemes and Justice Department files. The message from Washington never changed. No deals, no protection, no quarter. By February 62, the FBI was tightening the screws. In Los Angeles, agents checking phone records on Judith Campbell, Roselli's new girlfriend, found something explosive. Not only was Campbell in regular touch with Sam Giancana, but she was also calling President Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln. November 8th, November 18th. Calls from a woman bouncing between the mob and the Oval Office. On February 27th, Hoover personally sent the information to Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Kenneth O'Donnell, the White House Appointments Secretary, and RFK's old college roommate. No paper trail of their reactions survived. Years later, O'Donnell told the church committee he thought the tip was routine, nothing worth chasing, even with Mrs. Lincoln. But on March 15th, Courtney Evans, RFK's man inside the bureau, wrote another memo, this time to FBI Assistant Director August Belmont. Evans laid it out. Campbell wasn't just seeing Giancana and Roselli, she was still phoning the president's secretary. Fred Otash, a private eye and FBI informant in Los Angeles, was already talking about Campbell's double life, sleeping with both Roselli and Kennedy. Back in August 61, Otash said he'd heard from Bernard Spindle, a wiretap freelancer, that Hoffa wanted dirt. Names of West Coast prostitutes who'd been with John or Robert Kennedy. Hoffa believed that kind of information would let him bury both brothers. Word of the president's private life was already in mob circles. An FBI bug picked up one wise guy, griping, "Since when is fucking a federal offense? And if it is, I want the president indicted, because I know he was whacking all those broads Sinatra brought him." He said he'd gladly go to the penitentiary for life if it meant killing Kennedy. The feeling was raw. If the Kennedys took mob money and favors, then turned around and came at them full force, which was betrayal. 1 week later, March 22nd, Hoover sat down for a private lunch with the president. According to church committee records, the very last White House call between Kennedy and Judith Campbell came just hours after that meal. The next day, March 23rd, Hoover formally asked the CIA for a written opinion on whether Robert Maheu could be prosecuted for wiretapping Phyllis McGuire's hotel room in Las Vegas. The tap had been set to keep tabs on Giancana, who at the time was in Miami recruiting killers for the CIA's Castro project. The committee later implied Hoover might have been trying to bury the case to shield the president from embarrassment. But Hoover's own memos kept out of the committee's hands, show something else. On April 4th, he doubled down. He ordered his men to press every angle of Giancana's life with all possible speed to build a prosecutable case. He was still pounding away 6 weeks later. Then, on May 10th, Hoover told his top aides he'd briefed RFK personally. Kennedy gave him the whole story. The CIA had brought in Maheu, Giancana, the works, to plot Castro's assassination. Hoover called it most unfortunate, especially given the gossip, that Giancana had skated prosecution because of his ties to Sinatra, who in turn bragged about his ties to the Kennedys. RFK didn't deny it. He said it worried him more, but insisted, "Keep after Giancana." The problem was obvious. If the government tried to prosecute, Giancana could blow open the Castro plots in court. With prosecution off the table, the FBI stayed on him anyway. Into '63, the bugs and tails kept rolling in. They charted his pull in Chicago's First Ward, his contacts with Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Eddie Fisher, a parade of entertainers who came and went from Giancana's orbit. In November '62, Giancana opened the Villa Venice outside Chicago. Informants said he'd just met Sinatra and Fisher in Reno, under the alias Sam Mooney. Days later, Sinatra called Fisher with a message. "Forget the Desert Inn gig in Vegas, $100,000 a week. Come to Chicago instead." The pay was $15,000, but Sinatra wanted him at Villa Venice. Fisher told the FBI he did it as a favor to Frank. He admitted he recognized Sam Mooney as Phyllis McGuire's boyfriend, but swore he didn't know it was Sam Giancana. Then, November 29th, the FBI made a move. 2 agents walked straight into the Czech Lounge in Chicago, where they'd failed to get a bug planted. They confronted Giancana in front of Alderman John Darko and Paul Rieger. The Bureau already had tapes of Giancana plotting Darko's resignation for health reasons and lining up his nephew, Anthony de Tolve, as the replacement. Cuba crept into the bugs, too. October 29th, the day after Khrushchev pulled the missiles out, Giancana ripped into the Democrats. He blasted Kennedy's handling of Cuba, said if the administration spent less time putting people in jail, they wouldn't be in this mess abroad. By January 14th, after the Bay of Pigs prisoners were ransomed, his number 2, Chucky English, was overheard fuming. He said the feds were closing in. Nothing could stop it. He mocked RFK for raising ransom money for the exiles, saying the Chicago syndicate looked like amateurs compared to that kind of muscle. Late February, Giancana got a win. His man, Mike Fiorito, beat Frank Annunzio for First Ward alderman. Sam gloated. "That little obscenity, the Attorney General, he opens his mouth, but he found out who runs things around here." But the victory was short. Within weeks, Fiorito's voter registration was under investigation. In April, a bug caught Giancana's driver, John Matassa, laughing about Hoffa's tirade against RFK. Hoffa had accused the Attorney General of waging a personal vendetta against hoodlums on the taxpayer's dime. Giancana's file grew thick with taps and surveillance. But, for all the talk of singers and girlfriends, not one mention of Judith Campbell after spring 1961. Not one word about her supposed ties to Kennedy. Nothing about Marilyn Monroe, who died of a drug overdose in August '62. He almost never talked about other bosses, though the Bureau caught wind of big Florida meetings. And after his slip at that dinner party, he never mentioned the Castro plots again. By the end of '62, the picture was clear. Sam Giancana was boxed in by the Justice Department, by Hoover's men, by Kennedy's relentless war. But he was still on stage, still making deals, still playing Sinatra's friend and Phyllis McGuire's lover. A mob boss under siege, with the FBI parked outside and the CIA whispering his name in Havana. The tapes made one thing clear: Giancana was boxed in. The FBI had him in their sights, and the war would only intensify through 63. But if Giancana had the CIA tangled in his mess, Jimmy Hoffa was wide open. Hoffa's problems weren't about gunmen or CIA assassins. His cases were technical, buried in ledgers and pension fund scams. Most of the evidence had already been built by the McClellan Committee in the late 50s. When RFK took over justice, he brought in Walter Sheridan, ex-FBI, not a lawyer, but relentless. Sheridan and his Get Hoffa squad carried the files with them and went to work. Hoover hated Sheridan, but RFK trusted him. The first big fight was the Sun Valley deal in Florida. Hoffa had jacked up the price tag on a land tract that was supposed to become a Teamster retirement village. It was a fraud, and in 61, Hoffa slipped the indictment. But the case was still alive. Then came Test Fleet. Hoffa and a partner quietly set up a trucking company in their wives' names. First thing they did was borrow 50 grand from commercial carriers, a firm strangled by a wildcat strike. Once Hoffa got the money, the strike disappeared. The most serious case, kickbacks on Teamster pension fund loans, was still building and wouldn't see trial until 64. But Hoffa was already bleeding money and lawyers. By spring 1962, the courtroom battles were piling up. In March, the Sun Valley case came back to life. Hoffa tried to subpoena senators and federal officials, claiming the government used illegal wiretaps to build its case. The judge shut most of it down. In May, another problem. Frank Barron, a Teamster official, accused Hoffa of beating him up at Union headquarters. Weeks later, the Florida indictment was reinstated. Hoffa pled not guilty in Nashville on Test Fleet, and now the D.C. U.S. attorney was digging into Barron's assault complaint. July 19th was the killer. The Court of Appeals ruled Hoffa couldn't use union funds to pay for his defense. It was a direct hit to his war chest. Desperate, Hoffa's lawyers argued Sun Valley had to go before Test Fleet. It was a stall. Meanwhile, Hoffa was running his own counteroffensive. The Bureau was still tailing Judith Campbell in August 62. One night, they caught 2 men with Texas plates climbing onto her balcony. The car was registered to a former FBI man named Hale. The 2 matched descriptions of his sons. One married to Governor John Connolly's daughter. The Bureau never learned what they were doing there, but Hoffa already knew about Campbell and the president. He had it from Otash, the L.A. private eye, and Bernard Spindle, his personal wiretapper. He wanted proof. Hoffa still had political juice. Starting that August, more than a dozen senators and congressmen, Republicans like Homer Capehart, Democrats like Wayne Morse, took to the floor, railing that justice was trampling Hoffa's rights. Their speeches read like they came off the same typewriter. Most were up for re-election. Behind the scenes, a new character walked in, Edward Grady Partin, Baton Rouge Teamster boss, Marine Corps washout, a record that included breaking and entering, a manslaughter indictment, even a kidnapping beef. In September 62, Partin was in jail on 50 grand bond for forgery and embezzlement. After a few days inside, he told the DA he had information tied to national security and wanted federal agents. The DA called the U.S. attorney. The call went to Frank Grimsley of the Get Hoffa squad. Grimsley called Sheridan. Sheridan told him, "Get to Baton Rouge. October 1st, 3 a.m. Grimsley sat with Partin for 3 hours. Partin said that back in June he met Hoffa in D.C. Hoffa asked if he knew anything about plastic bombs. "I've got to do something about that son of a bitch Bobby Kennedy," Hoffa said, according to Partin. "He's got to go." Hoffa supposedly described RFK's routines, driving alone in his convertible, swimming without guards at his McLean estate. Easy targets for explosives. Hoffa also claimed he could get a silencer. Sheridan rushed the story to Jack Miller, head of the criminal division. They decided to polygraph Partin. The first test was a mess. The FBI's report said Partin showed possible deception, but his answers were so erratic they couldn't draw a clear conclusion. Partin admitted he was a liar by trade, especially in contract negotiations, and said he hadn't slept in 3 nights. He asked for a second test. 5 days later, his bond was cut from $50,000 to $5,000. He walked out, retook the polygraph, and passed. Sheridan wanted to run him as an informant. October 18th. Partin reached Hoffa. Hoffa invited him to Nashville, where the test fleet trial was about to start. Partin joined the inner circle: Alan Dorfman, mob fixer, Irving Davidson, Hoffa, and Marcello's DC contact, Puerto Rico teamster Frank Chavez. Hoffa thought he could fix anything. That belief destroyed him. Test fleet was a misdemeanor case, a year in jail max. But Partin reported that Hoffa, Dorfman, and another man were already plotting to buy the jury. First week of trial, a juror came forward, $10,000 offered to swing the vote. He was excused. Partin kept shuttling between Baton Rouge and Nashville, feeding Sheridan details. More bribes, 2 more jurors pulled. Hoffa took the stand, swore he had no stake in test fleet, even though it was in his wife's name. The jury deadlocked, 7-5 for acquittal. The government immediately filed jury tampering charges. That case dragged for over a year, but it stuck. Partin's testimony put Hoffa away. Even Chief Justice Earl Warren later questioned the conviction, pointing out Partin's history, the sweetheart deals he got, the bond reduction, the dropped charges. But the verdict held. Whether Hoffa really plotted to kill RFK with a plastic bomb, nobody can prove. Some say Marcello pushed Partin to tell it, exaggerating a grudge. RFK himself repeated the story later, saying Hoffa tried to hire a hoodlum with a silencer. One thing Hoffa got right: Robert Kennedy would never stop until Hoffa was in a cell. And Hoffa wasn't the only target. Marcello and Trafficante knew if Hoffa lost control of the pension funds, their pipeline dried up. By late '62, with pressure mounting, whispers of assassination weren't just about Bobby. They were about the president himself. The Justice Department still couldn't nail most of the bosses. No RICO Act, no witness protection. The FBI leaned on harassment and surveillance, the same tactics they'd used on communists in the 50s. At first, they even planted bugs in mob bedrooms, expecting pillow talk. They learned fast. Mob guys didn't mix business with sex the way leftists did. Trafficante was the hardest to pin. From '61 into '62, he bounced between Tampa, Miami, San Juan, and anywhere else the feds couldn't follow. By September '61, the Tampa office was trying to bug his house, his businesses, even his associates. They were opening his mail. An informant said Trafficante wanted to take out a Miami financier who stiffed him on a $50,000 Havana hotel deposit. Another saw him in Miami with Dino Cellini, tied to Tony Verona and Martin Fox, the Havana casino man who once had dinner in Dallas with Jack Ruby. Another informant said Trafficante was hiding in the Florida Keys under the name Luis Santos, the same alias he used at the Trescornia detention camp in Havana in 1959, when Jack Ruby visited him. RFK brought the IRS in. January 11th, 1962, the U.S. Attorney in Tampa filed a complaint. Santo and 3 brothers, $46,000 in back taxes. His lawyer, Frank Regano, soon to double as Hoffa's lawyer, said Santo wanted to sue the government for libel. Regano told him not to. Then came whispers of new opportunities. Things were heating up across America, and by December 1962, The chaos spilled right into Jimmy Hoffa's courtroom. On Thursday, December 6th, the Salisbury Post ran a headline that stunned the country. Hoffa had been shot inside the courthouse. The gunman wasn't a mobster or a union rival. He was Warren Swanson, 28, an ex-mental patient from Washington, D.C. He walked into the Nashville courtroom during Hoffa's conspiracy trial and fired an air pistol at him. The pellets bounced harmlessly off Hoffa's chest. Hoffa didn't run. He charged. He lunged at Swanson, swung punches and kicks, and his men piled on. A deputy marshal cracked Swanson across the head with his revolver, and one of Hoffa's bodyguards got a few shots of his own before marshals dragged the bleeding man out in handcuffs. Swanson needed 14 stitches. At the hospital, he told reporters he had come to kill Hoffa. He had never met him. He claimed he had been in a Cincinnati hotel room reading the Bible when he heard a voice. "You have to kill Jimmy Hoffa." It said it twice. Swanson admitted the weapon was a pellet gun because that was all he could afford. The ad said it was effective. It didn't say it was lethal, but it led you to believe it would kill, he explained. The judge, William Miller, locked the courtroom down. 6 new armed marshals were posted. Everyone would be searched. The jury, absent when it happened, was sequestered overnight to keep the story out of their ears. For Hoffa, the timing was perfect. His attorneys seized the attack as proof. Robert Kennedy's relentless headlines and federal pressure had poisoned the atmosphere. How could Hoffa possibly get a fair trial? Behind closed doors, Hoffa raged. He believed this wasn't random, that the government, the deep state, had sent Swanson to finish him. To him, this wasn't about a lunatic's vision or a toy gun. It was an assassination attempt, ordered from the top. What no one in that courtroom realized was that this moment, the talk of killing a public figure splashed across headlines, was an omen. December 1962 was the month the idea entered the American mainstream. And within a year, it wouldn't be Hoffa in the crosshairs. It would be John Kennedy. While Jimmy Hoffa was raging about his trial, he didn't know he had a rat in his camp. Ed Partin, a teamster out of Baton Rouge, was wired up and feeding Robert Kennedy everything. Every conversation, every plan, it went straight into the Attorney General's office. But the courtroom drama wasn't the only fire heating up. The political field was boiling over too. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was desperate. He knew the Americans hadn't stopped trying to kill him. The papers talked about open hostility, but the real war was underground. Operation Mongoose and a dozen other CIA programs aimed straight at him. Castro believed if he could guarantee security for his people, he might hang on to power and keep Cuba as a socialist fortress. But the odds were impossible. The CIA was the most powerful intelligence machine in the world, flush with money and backed by the Pentagon. They were going to put something in front of John F. Kennedy that would rattle him like no president since Pearl Harbor. That moment would come in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The mob thought the winds were shifting. They believed Kennedy might finally cut a deal with them, stop hunting them, and use them as assets against Castro the way Nixon had. But Kennedy and his brother saw it differently. As far as they were concerned, Castro was in power because of the Mafia, the casinos, the corruption, the rot they spread through Havana and beyond. The Kennedys weren't going to lean on gangsters. They were going to deal directly with the man who gave Castro his shield, Nikita Khrushchev. Names swirled in the shadows. David Ferry, Guy Bannister, Jack Ruby, Lauren Hall, CIA cutouts, and mob players like Russell Bufalino, Meyer Lansky, Santo Trafficante, and John Martino. But for 13 days, the only names that mattered were Kennedy and Khrushchev. 63 years ago, on Tuesday morning, October 16th, 1962, Kennedy was still in his bathrobe at the White House when National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy broke the news. Hard photographic evidence showed Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. Kennedy stayed silent. For 6 days, he told the public nothing. Then, on October 22nd, he went on television and delivered the news himself. The missiles had to go. The world held its breath. The US military went to a full war footing. Kennedy told aides he thought the odds of nuclear war were 50-50. Marines and Army units massed in Florida. Bomb shelters were stocked. At sea, 63 American ships formed a blockade line around Cuba. By October 24th, reports came in that 20 Soviet ships approaching the blockade had either stopped dead in the water or turned back. "We're eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked," Secretary of State Dean Rusk said. But work on the missile sites in Cuba continued. On October 26th, Khrushchev sent a rambling letter offering a deal. He'd remove the missiles if Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba. The next morning came a second letter, harder, more dangerous. The Soviets wanted US missiles out of Turkey. The choice was brutal. Give in and look weak, or refuse and risk war. Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin in Washington that night. He laid it out plain. Remove the missiles within 24 hours, or the US would take them out by force. Then he quietly promised the US Jupiter missiles in Turkey would be gone within months. The next day, October 28th, Khrushchev backed down. Soviet missiles would be dismantled and shipped home. Kennedy was praised as a genius for handling the crisis, though critics later accused him of bluff and luck. Khrushchev claimed it wasn't a defeat. The whole point of putting missiles in Cuba, he said, was to stop an invasion, and once Kennedy pledged not to invade, the job was done. In reality, Kennedy had been ready to trade. The missiles in Turkey were pulled out quietly 3 months later. But the world only saw one thing. The Soviets blinked, and Kennedy had stood firm. The mob never got the deal they hoped for. To the Kennedys, organized crime was part of the disease that led to Cuba in the first place. And while Hoffa screamed in court, betrayed by his own man, the President of the United States had just stared down the Soviets, with the world on the edge of nuclear fire. They were Kennedy's best and brightest, confident, brilliant, the kind of men who thought they could bend history if they worked hard enough. The Cuban Missile Crisis would test that. 13 days where every option ended with the world in ashes. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, still remembered the morning after Kennedy's October 22nd address. He woke up and thought, how lucky we're still here. Nuclear war was that close. They didn't know what Moscow would do next, but an attack was on the table. Too damn dangerous, Rusk said years later. The crisis made both sides more cautious. Out of it came the Test Ban Treaty, civil air agreements, non-proliferation talks, even the anti-ballistic missile pact under Nixon. But it also embarrassed Moscow, forcing Khrushchev into a retreat, and maybe triggered the arms race that followed. Rusk believed Khrushchev blinked because he knew the truth. America had overwhelming nuclear superiority near Cuba. That humiliation, Rusk said, helped push Khrushchev out of power 2 years later. It also infuriated Fidel Castro, who saw it as a personal betrayal. Oddly, Rusk admitted, US spy photos never caught a single warhead on a Cuban launcher ready to fire. They intended to settle the crisis before it got to that stage. If not, Kennedy was prepared to order airstrikes in a matter of days. McGeorge Bundy, Kennedy's national security advisor, got the first call. A CIA officer told him the Soviets had missiles in Cuba. Bundy didn't wake the president. Kennedy was worn out from campaigning, and Bundy didn't want to spook the dinner guests in his home that night. He figured it could wait until morning. When Kennedy was briefed, the first theory was that it might be a Soviet trap. A blockade of Cuba became the front-running plan, but Bundy worried it would invite a Soviet blockade of Berlin. That city, split in two, was another tripwire. Inside the White House, debate split into three camps: airstrikes, a tighter blockade, or diplomacy. Bundy saw all the risks. Kennedy didn't have to decide. Khrushchev folded. Looking back, Bundy said the crisis left a permanent legacy of caution. Nobody had taken the world that close to open conflict since. He thought Kennedy's leadership benefited from the Bay of Pigs disaster. This time, Kennedy listened to everyone: hawks, doves, and people in between. The conventional wisdom was that forcing Khrushchev to remove the missiles fueled the Soviet nuclear buildup through the 60s. Bundy wasn't convinced. He thought the buildup was already in motion. The crisis just reminded both sides there was a line you didn't cross. Nobody's wanted to do this again since, he said. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, was stunned. Moscow had been assuring Washington for months it wouldn't put offensive weapons in Cuba. Then the photos came in. Missiles, clear as day. It seemed so irresponsible, so irrational, so dangerous it was hard to believe, McNamara recalled. Even with proof, McNamara opposed an airstrike. He argued the balance of power hadn't changed. The US had 5,000 warheads to the Soviets' 300. Even if Russia launched first, America would have enough left to absolutely destroy the Soviet Union. McNamara believed the danger of nuclear exchange had been exaggerated. He never thought it was probable. But even if the odds were 1 in 50, he said, that was enough to terrify him. The result would have been total disaster. He agreed with Rusk and Bundy. The crisis improved US-Soviet relations. Out of it came the Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct link to avoid misunderstandings. Small step, but important. The frame of mind was, my God, let's not get into that again. The way US ships operate in the Persian Gulf today traces straight back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. 25 years earlier, Kennedy and his men had learned the hard way. If you left the military to its own instincts, the world could burn. During those October days in 1962, the White House kept a chokehold on the Pentagon. Every move came from the Oval Office. Navy captains enforcing the quarantine weren't free to improvise. Orders were drilled down from Robert McNamara himself. The Chief of Naval Operations had to pick up the phone, ship by ship, to make sure McNamara's instructions were carried out word for word. That was the birth of what's now routine: tight civilian micromanagement. Today, a Navy commander in the Gulf has rules of engagement, so detailed they might as well be a checklist. Before 1962, it was the opposite. Washington told the military what not to do: don't use nukes, don't cross this line, and everything else was left to the man on the scene. Kennedy never trusted that. The Bay of Pigs had soured him on the generals. He believed the brass had given him bad advice and nearly wrecked his presidency. When the missiles in Cuba showed up, the Pentagon pushed for airstrikes, maybe even an invasion. Kennedy turned to the civilians he trusted: McNamara, Dean Rusk, Robert Kennedy. The Joint Chiefs were frozen out. Air Force Chief Curtis LeMay wanted an invasion and swore the Soviets wouldn't respond. Kennedy didn't buy it. Years later, Robert Kennedy wrote about that exchange. LeMay never forgave the slight. The Navy's George Anderson clashed with McNamara even harder. On October 24th, the day Soviet ships steamed toward the blockade line, McNamara showed up unannounced at the Navy Command Center. He and a deputy started firing off classified questions in front of officers without clearance. Anderson pulled him into a back room, laid out the situation, then tried to leave. McNamara told him, "It's all right." Anderson snapped back, "You go to your office. I'll go to mine. We'll take care of things." McNamara was livid. A year later, Anderson's career was over. He was denied reappointment. For Kennedy and the civilians, the lesson was simple: don't let the generals run the show. The crisis had proved nuclear superiority wasn't enough. You needed conventional power in the right place at the right time, and you needed the president in control. For Anderson and the uniformed side, the lesson was bitter. The main thing to do, he said years later, is have good people in the jobs, give them what it takes to do the jobs, and then keep your hands off. Carlo Gambino sat down and immediately found himself surrounded by enemies. Vito Genovese, Joe Bonanno, Longhi Zwilman, Carmine Galante, Vincent Gigante. Even men inside his own family were whispering against him. He crushed most of them. And when that was over, he faced a different kind of war. One that didn't end in backrooms or alleys, but in courtrooms and government offices. The commission was one thing. The FBI, the IRS, and especially the Immigration Department was something else. That last one, the mob had never bothered to buy. Now it was coming after them. The list of targets was long. Russell Bufalino, Carlo Gambino, Frank Costello, Tommy Lucchese, Carlos Marcello, and others who had forged papers, lied about birth certificates, or slipped through Ellis Island under fake names. The only thing holding the line was Carlos Marcello's deportation trial. If he lost, the floodgates opened. Washington had figured out deportation could cripple the Mafia. By the early 60s, the country was ready. People wanted to believe someone could finally put a collar on organized crime. All the government needed was a witness to map it out. Structure, ranks, initiation, on the record. One insider flipping could change the game. Suddenly, men who thought they were untouchable would have two choices: prison for life or a one-way ticket back to Italy. Then came the Kennedys. In 1959, during the McClellan Committee hearings, Senator John F. Kennedy put it bluntly, "If they're crooks, we don't wound 'em, we kill 'em." 2 years later, his brother Robert took over as Attorney General. He made the mission clear. If we do not, on a national scale, attack organized criminals with weapons and techniques as effective as their own, they will destroy us. This was new. Before the Kennedys, presidents and attorneys general barely touched organized crime. Truman didn't want the Kefauver hearings. Eisenhower didn't push the McClellan investigation. To most Americans in the 50s, the Mafia didn't even exist. That blind spot came from one man, J. Edgar Hoover. Director of the FBI since 1924, Hoover insisted publicly and privately that there was no Mafia. Even Appalachian in 1957, when police stumbled onto a summit of mob bosses, didn't move him. His deputies wrote a detailed report on the meeting. Hoover ordered it destroyed. Baloney, he called it. And at FBI headquarters, it was never mentioned again. Only when Joe Valachi testified in the Senate in 1963 did Hoover finally admit organized crime was real. But even then, he refused to use the word mafia. Valachi called it Cosa Nostra, our thing. Hoover softened it to La Cosa Nostra, then to LCN. From then on, FBI memos referred to LCN hoodlum Carlo Gambino, or LCN meeting at La Stella restaurant. It was Hoover's way of pretending he wasn't wrong all along. The clash between Robert Kennedy and Hoover was inevitable. Kennedy was 35, determined to launch the biggest federal assault on organized crime in history. Hoover was 66, entrenched and stubborn. One wanted war. The other claimed there was no enemy. Kennedy moved anyway. He drew up a hit list of 40 targets: mob bosses, underbosses, labor racketeers. At the top was Jimmy Hoffa, then Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Santos Traficante in Florida, Sam Giancana in Chicago, Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia. Gambino was further down the line. The results came fast. In 1961 alone, 121 mobsters indicted, 73 convicted. By the end of 1962, the numbers doubled. 350 indicted, 138 convicted. By the end of 1963, 615 indicted, 288 convicted. For the first time, organized crime wasn't untouchable. Wiretaps placed by the FBI in 1962 confirmed it. The pressure was real. Bosses across the country were feeling the heat. Robert Kennedy's war had thrown the Mafia off balance. And Carlo Gambino, who had survived every war inside his world, was now watching a new war unfold. This one wasn't fought with guns in the street. It was fought with subpoenas, deportation orders, and microphones hidden in restaurant ceilings. They knew how to fight. The real bosses, Carlos Marcello, Carlo Gambino, and the men around them, didn't boast into wiretaps. They kept their counsel like generals. But wars are fought by armies, and armies talk. Made men, captains, cousins, girlfriends. The chatter that escaped into Brooklyn diners and back rooms was different from the measured language of a don. It was breathless, resentful, loud enough for microphones. People started whispering about the Kennedys. They cursed them, they schemed, they wanted blood. J. Edgar Hoover heard much of it. What's striking is not that the threats existed, but that Hoover shrugged them off as bluster. He filed the conversations and moved on. To many in the underworld, which was proof the problem wasn't Hoover at all, it was the Kennedys who had stirred him into action. Rumor and resentment braided into conspiracy. The mob claimed Kennedy knew about Hoover's private life, that Kennedy could squeeze Hoover with what he had dug up. The old Iron Curtain of Washington's secrets, McCarthy, Roy Cohn, the Red Scare's purges, fed the paranoia. Men who ran the rackets believed they were watching a political play where every player had a hidden motive. They talked about danger not as fantasy, but as policy. Those conversations show the difference between command and mutter. In Brooklyn on May 2, 1962, tapes caught Michelino Clemente and Sal Profaci folding anger into a plan. Bob Kennedy won't stop today until he puts us all in jail. When we meet, we all got to shake hands and sit down and talk. If there is any trouble with a regime, it's got to be kept. It's the voice of men trying to impose order on the panic. They wanted the commission to act, to stamp down the heat before it burned them. 2 weeks earlier, on February 17th, FBI bugs picked up Angelo Bruno trading theories about Kennedy with Mario and Peter Maggio. The Maggios said Kennedy would move to make a special assistant to the president, that Kennedy was starting to hurt too many people. Then a slur. Hoover was a fairy. Bruno laughed the line off. Who would ever listen to that bullshit? But the insult mattered less than the fear behind it. The talk kept returning to one idea. Kennedy had to be stopped. The language grew cruder and colder. On February 8th, a tape caught Bruno and a business associate, Willie Weisberg, in a moment that tasted like a verdict. With a Kennedy, a guy should take a knife. Someone should kill the fucker. I mean it. Honest to God. I'll kill. Right in the fucking White House. The words were shouted, obscene, almost cartoonish in their audacity. Yet they were real. And once recorded, they were evidence. Not of an immediate plot, perhaps, but of the climate. A subterranean wish for assassination that circulated easily among men with access to violence. By May 1963, the FBI's ears reached into the Gambino family directly after a young associate attacked an agent. Wiretaps that followed produced more of the same soundtrack: anger, menace, scheming. The bosses rarely put plans to paper or into the open, but the underlings spoke. They named targets. They fantasized about knives and shootings. They measured their rage in the flat, private way of men who expected someone else to pick up the gun. Threats, talk, and rumors do not equal conspiracy proved. Courts require plans, organizers, act, and intent. But words shape action. They hardened the Justice Department's case that a national campaign against organized crime wasn't paranoia. It was necessity. To Washington, the recording of those muttered threats and violent boasts changed the conversation from one of toleration to one of prosecution. And to men like Gambino and Marcello, the message was clear. The old rules were breaking. The war would now be run through subpoenas and deportations as surely as through bullets. The underworld's bravado, caught on wires and filed in federal offices, had, in the end, become a weapon turned on itself. Carlo Gambino wrapped himself in layers of protection. The first was his image. On paper, he was a labor negotiator, a man who settled disputes in unions. In public, he looked like a meek, soft-spoken old man. When the McClellan Committee called him to testify about Appalachian, he faked a heart attack before the hearings even began. They carried him out on a stretcher. Playing sick, playing weak, pretending to be senile. It was all part of the act. After that, Gambino cut back on public appearances. He stayed inside, came out mostly at night, and if he traveled, it was usually to Miami. Like in the 40s, the bosses followed a rhythm. Summers in New York, winters in the sun. But Miami brought new problems. Every trip meant reporting to the authorities. Every move tracked. Back in New York, his men were being wired up. In April 1963, Carmine the doctor. Lombardozzi's father died. Lombardozzi was one of Gambino's most valuable capos, his Wall Street man, his financial brain. The funeral in Brooklyn drew the mob's top brass. FBI agents were there too, snapping plates and faces, recording every sign of respect. But outside the church, things broke script. Two young men, one a Lombardozzi relative named Danny Marino, spotted an agent with a hidden camera. They pounced. The agent, John Foley, hit the ground, his attaché case spilling, and was stopped in front of the mourners. It was unprecedented. The Mafia never laid hands on FBI agents. The beating forced Hoover to face what he'd spent decades denying. Within weeks, the Bureau launched a storm of electronic surveillance on Gambino's crew. The bugs paid off. In May, an FBI wire caught a talk between Pete Ferrara, a Gambino capo, and acting capo Mike Scandifia. They sat in the half-light, the kind of room where the walls listened. Scandifia didn't bother with small talk. "They're giving you the zing," he said. "Midnight raids. They want to use a stick. You're a captain, Carl's family. They want you." Ferrara shrugged, but his eyes didn't lie. One of the men pushed a photograph across the table. "You know him?" the man asked. "Sure," Ferrara said. 20, 30 years. He didn't reach for the picture. "Carlo's a businessman. Raised 4 kids. Good educations. They're all married professionals. Nice family. What else you ask for?" He let the words hang like smoke. "That's all I told them. See what they do? They're sending a message," Scandifia spat low. "They want heat on you. On me. They call us captains. One says foreman, another says capo regina. They're carving up heads." "What can they do?" Ferrara barked a short laugh. "My daughter's a nun. They want to embarrass me. Throw her out of the convent?" "God forbid," Scandifia said. "They couldn't even throw Albert Anastasia's brother out. And he was a priest. They can't touch her. But that's how low they go. Dirty bastards. Pete, the Cosa Nostra is wide open now." "An open book," Ferrara agreed, voice flat. Word moved fast. By May 20th, Bruno was meeting with Magliocco and the Maggio cousins, and the feds were listening. Bruno remembered the names they read off. Capos, underboss, consigliere. And the questions. Had Carlo changed the rules? Had he sanctioned hits on FBI men? The answer came with a warning. They broke a man's head to prove a point. Next time, they said, it would be worse. 2 weeks later, in Buffalo, Mangano's voice came through a wire. They knew the bosses, the commission, every man's place. They even asked about Carlo's capo regime. Who came to tell him what? They were talking like they belonged. And when men spoke like that, everyone at the table felt the cold edge of it. The beating at the Lombardozzi funeral had blown the doors open. Without it, the FBI probably would have left Gambino in relative peace. Records later showed that for all Robert Kennedy's talk of making Gambino a priority target, the Bureau barely touched him during Kennedy's time as Attorney General. The focus was elsewhere. Curiously, the only personal attention Kennedy seemed to give Gambino wasn't about crime at all. He was more disturbed by the marriages in the Gambino bloodline. Carlo had married his Castellano first cousin, the daughter of his mother's sister. Other cousin marriages linked the Gambinos and Castellanos in Brooklyn and Palermo. To Kennedy, a devout Catholic, it was appalling, against church doctrine. He even told the FBI to alert the Archdiocese of New York. That, plus the brief storm after Lombardozzi's funeral, was the extent of the federal pressure on Carlo Gambino under the Kennedys. Behind the curtain of weakness he presented to the world, Gambino had once again managed what he did best: survival. What protected Carlos Marcello was the same thing shielding Carlo Gambino: the art of blackmail. Both men understood power wasn't only muscle or money. It was leverage. They surrounded themselves with people who collected secrets, who were ready to drag an enemy into the gutter, ruin reputations, wreck families, and push men to the brink of suicide if that's what it took. You didn't cross Gambino or Marcello without risking everything you had, down to your kids' futures. When Robert Kennedy tried to clamp down on Marcello in 61 and 62, he left the job to the FBI's Louisiana office, relying on reports from Agent Aaron Cohn. But Cohn couldn't do much. Louisiana was Marcello's turf. Judges, sheriffs, even senators were in his pocket. Local FBI men hated being exiled there in the first place. They weren't eager to pick a fight with Marcello, and around him was a protective circle: Guy Bannister, Hoover's loyalist, Irving Davidson, the fixer, Jack Wasserman, the attorney, and a string of political friends and enforcers. In Louisiana, Marcello was untouchable. Robert Kennedy was finding that out the hard way. By 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations would confirm what Kennedy suspected years earlier. The FBI had failed to adequately investigate Carlos Marcello, even though he'd been named Kennedy's number 2 target, right behind Jimmy Hoffa. The Bureau's neglect raised a larger question. Why had Hoover held back not only on Marcello, but also on Carlo Gambino? The answer led back to Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the underworld. Costello had been the mob's fixer throughout the 40s and 50s, until Vito Genovese sent Vincent the Chin Gigante to put a bullet in his head in 1957. Costello survived, retreated to his Long Island estate, but never fully retired. He still held court at the Waldorf Astoria, settling disputes between mobsters and politicians alike. Costello was tied closely to both Gambino and Marcello. He'd helped Gambino set up Genovese on a narcotics rap that sent him away for life, and when Mayor LaGuardia chased Costello's slot machines out of New York, Marcello gave them a home in Louisiana. The three men formed an alliance that stretched from New York to New Orleans. But Costello had another friend, J. Edgar Hoover. For years, rumors swirled about their meetings, on a bench in Central Park, at the track, in the Waldorf lobby. It wasn't idle gossip. William Hundley, head of organized crime in Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, later confirmed it. Over breakfast with attorney Edward Bennett Williams, Costello's lawyer. Hundley heard it from the man himself. Costello admitted he and Hoover had an understanding. Not about mob business. Costello would never betray the code. The favors were simpler. Hoover loved the horses. He was an addict at the track. And Costello could deliver fixed winners, passed from bookmaker Frank Erickson to columnist Walter Winchell to Costello, and finally to Hoover. Costello laughed as he told Hundley, "The horse races? You'll never know how many races I had to fix for those lousy $10 bets of Hoover's." Hoover's betting was no secret inside the bureau. He'd pose for photographers at the $2 window, while his men quietly placed his real $100 wagers. And for Hoover, the tips always came through. Why would he risk that sweet arrangement by going after Costello's allies, Gambino and Marcello? He wouldn't. So, while Robert Kennedy called Gambino a priority target, the FBI barely touched him. Only when a Gambino hothead beat an FBI agent did Hoover stir himself into action, and even then, it was less about crime than about restoring the Bureau's prestige. The same shield extended to Marcello. That protection would have grim consequences. In 1979, after 2 years of reinvestigation, Congress's Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that Carlos Marcello was the Mafia boss most likely to have participated in a unilateral plot to kill President John F. Kennedy. The assassination neutralized Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime. By the time he returned to the Justice Department, Lyndon Johnson had cut him out, and Hoover wouldn't even take his calls. The campaign lost momentum, then collapsed. For Gambino and Marcello, it was back to business. By the late 60s and early 70s, they were number 1 and 2 in the national Cosa Nostra hierarchy, building empires that raked in billions a year. They had survived presidents, prosecutors, and the full weight of the federal government. And they had done it with the oldest weapons in the mob arsenal: silence, loyalty, and blackmail.